This lesson is about consumer surplus and producer surplus. You're going to get used to seeing graphs like this in the economics portion of this calculus, but let's dissect some of the words first. What is meant by surplus in economics? Contrary to sort of common vernacular, where surplus means extra stuff lying around, things that you have that are beyond what you may have needed. That's what I think of when I hear the word surplus outside of economics. In an economics or calculus class, surplus means extra money lying around from the sale of something and not extra product itself. So when we talk about consumer surplus and producer surplus, the answers are going to be in dollars. We're talking about extra money that the consumers have or extra money that the producers have for a particular situation. So surplus is money, just to start with that. But what is meant by a demand curve? If you look at the red curve in this function, the demand curve, you'll notice a common economic notion that as the quantity of a particular item goes up, as there's more and more of something, the price tends to drop. And that's what we mean by a demand curve. A demand curve is the price of an item based on its quantity available. The same is true for a supply curve. As the supply of a particular object goes up, then the price on the supply curve tends to go up as well. So, with those ideas in mind, what do we mean by consumer surplus? Well, to really understand this concept well, you have to take an economics class. But for the purposes of calculus, we'll consider consumer surplus as the amount of money left collectively in consumer pockets, so to speak, based on the fact that consumers got things cheaper than they might have been willing to pay for those items. And likewise, a producer surplus is an amount of money sort of collectively in all the producers' ledgers or bank accounts, that it represents the amount of money that they have based on the fact that they would have been willing to sell something for cheaper but didn't have to. And it's worth noting before we start the calculus here that these concepts are not static. When an item first becomes available, we don't know what the demand curve is going to look like, and we don't know what the supply curve is going to look like. Economists and business people make guesses and then set prices accordingly. But in real world terms, the supply curve and the demand curve are changing over time. And I just want to begin this calculus lesson by saying that while we in this class treat them as static or unchanging, they really aren't in true economic real life. But putting all of that behind us, what are we actually going to do in this class? Well, we're going to numerically compute the number of dollars in consumer surplus and the number of dollars for the producer surplus. How are we going to do this? Well, the first thing we're going to do is find this so-called equilibrium point. You'll notice in the diagram. And the equilibrium point is an economic ideal that essentially says wherever the supply and demand curves meet, that's where the price of something will be set. Again, I don't want to give the impression that when a new product is put out, that all of a sudden we know the demand curve, we know the supply curve, and we know the equilibrium point. That's not the case. In real life, products come out, things change, different ideas and prices and supply quantities are tried out until we get to some sort of equilibrium over time. But after an item's been out and the price has been fluctuating over time, eventually the supply and demand curves are known and the equilibrium point is also known. But in this class, we kind of assume that a lot of time has passed and that we already know these quantities. So what we'll do is find the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price. Notice I've called them Q and P in the diagram here. And in order to compute the consumer and producer surplus, which is our ultimate goal, we need to know the areas of those two shaded regions in the diagram. And why are those areas the dollar amounts of surplus in either the consumers or producers' pockets? Well, that is a complicated economic thing that we won't dive into. But to focus on the calculus here, to compute the areas of those shaded regions in the diagram, we need integrals. That, you learned in Calc 1, is how to compute the area in a graphic situation. So using what we learned in Calculus 1, we can compute the consumer surplus by just integrating the top curve minus bottom curve. But in this case, the bottom curve is just a flat line where the function y equals p. Likewise, we'll compute this producer surplus, the bottom shaded region, by once again integrating top curve minus bottom curve. In this case, the top curve is the equilibrium price, and the bottom curve is the supply curve. These are the formulas that you'll use to compute these quantities when you try the problems.